Since we are coming from all parts of the world to this session today, a very good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. My name is Aarti Ramaswamy. For those who don't know me, I'm here based in Singapore at ESSEC Business School. And on behalf of the INDAM team and the organizing team, Naga, Sendil, Tanvi, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the INDAM Research Seminar. We have an incredible hour and a half ahead of us. But before we deep dive into the panel discussion, I would like to share with you two brief messages. The first one is of gratitude. Thank you to all our participants here. We are still counting 63. We have about 89 registered, to our 18 mentors and the 3 panelists for your commitment to keep this conversation going. Of course, we were not able to meet at the Academy of Management meeting earlier this year, but we are very glad that we could make this happen and still meet each other online. My second message is of connection. Needless to say and state the obvious, but sometimes it's better to acknowledge some things. This year has been incredible, challenging for many of us, for our teams, for our faculty and staff, for our students, our alumni, our colleagues, the way we do research, the way we teach, the way we engage with each other, the way we work, the way we travel, and the way we educate has completely been, as they say, disrupted. But here we are today, together online, connected by a sense of commitment to our research, commitment to this community, and our commitment to INDAM. And for that, I thank you very much and welcome you again to this session. This brings us hope for many more webinars to come and many more occasions to meet in person. Without further ado, I would like to share with you the 5 components of today's meeting. So we start with a panel discussion that will run for about so I took 2 minutes, so that would be 18 minutes for the panel discussion. And after that, we put you into breakout rooms that will go on for about 40 minutes. And after that, you come back into a sharing session, which will run for 15 minutes. That will be moderated by me again. And then we move on to shift gears to a brainstorming session to see how can we move forward from the sharing and the learnings and the insights that you have gained from talking with each other and connecting with each other today. And a few closing remarks from Naga, as well as Vishal Gupta, President of INDAM. We have 3 amazing panelists joining us today. Anand Nandkumar from ISB, Tanvi Kothari from San Jose State University, and Vishal Gupta from the University of Alabama. I believe Naga has shared with you their 3 papers. They're all very diverse papers, spanning multiple topics, micro as well as macro. So Vishal Gupta shared with us a paper on CFO gender and financial statement irregularities. Congratulations on the publication in AMJ. This is a very recent one. We also have a paper from Anand from 2016, the differential impact of markets for technology on the value of technological resources. So this was published in SMJ. And finally, a paper from Tanvi Kothari, published in the Journal of World Business on emerging market multinational companies' evolutionary paths to building a competitive advantage from emerging markets to developed countries. So the way, just a quick overview of the format of the panel discussion. I have a couple of questions that I would share with the panelists, and each of them will take turns to answer that question. We move on to question 2. And we also, of course, want to leave time for the audience, all of you, to engage with the panelists and ask questions. And for that, I request you to please put in your questions into the chat box. And Sendil, my dear colleague, will moderate that and share with the panelists any questions that come up in the chat. Because we have very diverse papers and we have a very diverse audience, the discussion for today is going to be focused on topics that are relevant for all of us, which is the research process itself. And for many of our junior colleagues and PhD students and budding researchers, this is something that would be extremely beneficial. So why don't we deep dive into the first question. I'm going to start with Anand, then Tanvi, and then Vishal in that order, if that's okay. Tell us a little bit about your paper, Anand. What inspired you to write this paper? Where did this idea come from? What gave you sleepless nights to answer that one hypothesis or the question? Beyond the need to get published, to get tenure, let's focus on the process, on the love for research. What is it that inspired you for this paper? And how did you sustain your research stamina? Because it takes stamina to work on a paper for a few years. And a few insights on that would be great. And then I will pass on after you the mic to, or the proverbial virtual mic to Tanvi, and then we hear from Vishal after. Anand, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Naga and Aarti, for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. So, to answer these specific questions, this one of the reasons why I thought I'd discuss this paper. This is one of my the quickest publication that I ever had. So, I think from start to finish, about a year and 2 months is what I remember. So, the quickest from the time to creation to publication, well, to being, at least getting an R&R. So in that sense, it was one of the quickest. And that was also partly driven by the problem. So I'm essentially trained as an empiricist, right? So although I work in strategy, my training was not in strategy, but I have this idea of, since I came from economics as a profession, so the way the economists think about heterogeneity is not how we as strategists think about heterogeneity, and that was the fundamental motivation for me to write this paper. So, for example, we typically use heterogeneity as a nuisance parameter in economics simply because we are interested. Most of the economists are interested in the average effects of whatever they are theorizing about. Whereas most of the questions, at least in macro, are around heterogeneity. And this is what got me inspired about, why are these empirical techniques borrowed from some other discipline when the inherent nature of the question itself is fundamentally different, right? That's what motivated me to write or even think about an empirical technique to take a crack at this problem. And the context in which we applied it was also related to what I was working on or continue to work on even now, which is markets for technology, which is one of the areas my dissertation was all about. So it naturally. So we had a problem that we wanted to apply, and we also had a sort of a philosophical issue that we wanted to deal with in this paper. Philosophical in an econometric sense, in a measurement sense, or in a sense of understanding heterogeneity itself. And that's what motivated us to write this paper.
Thank you, Anand, for sharing that. Why don't we hear from Tanvi as well?
So mine was slightly on the opposite spectrum, one of the papers that took me the longest to publish. And that was one of the reasons I shared that, because I wanted to share that journey with everybody, that it wasn't a quick hit for me in this case. And the motivation, and I would be amiss if I did not acknowledge my co-author and mentor for this paper, Mike Kutabi, who was also my dissertation advisor. So this is a paper that evolved out of my dissertation. But the core idea about emerging markets and this discussion basically came out of reading an economist, back in 2008, when they were talking about Mahindra tractors being sold in the United States and competing with the domestic brands. And that was kind of the genesis of that whole idea. And the whole interest in emerging markets was at a broader level because I come from a family business background, and these things were something that I was seeing when I was growing up, as many of you may have. But it was like, okay, what is the research question? And that kind of, hit the nail for me, especially with that economist article. And from a methods piece, this was an interesting article in the senses that I had been using different tools, but at the same time, when I read that article, I was taking a class in communications as part of the PhD program. And that's where I was learning network analysis and semantic network analysis. And that's where the idea came up. It's like, well, why don't the two marry up and we could kind of make it into a fun dissertation. So I'll pass the mic to the next person. That's Vishal, I guess.
Thank you, Tanvi. That was short and quick. So some of you may not know, but there are actually two Vishal Guptas on this call. I am Vishal K. So don't mix up the two. The other Vishal Gupta from IIM Ahmedabad, he's the president of INDAM, not me. So so just so you know, we both get emails that are meant for each other. This paper, CFO Gender and Financial Statement Irregularities, really started. The idea started from a conversation that Sandra Motel, who's a co-author on this paper, and she also happens to be my wife, by the way. So this is a good example of husband-wife working together constructively, by the way. So she and I were discussing our interest in gender with Bidisha Chakrabarti, who's at St. Louis University, and she had interest in financial irregularities. And she was playing with this new way of looking at financial irregularities called the Benford score. And I won't go into the details of that, but the idea was that she was playing with that. We had this idea of executive gender. That's something we've been looking at for quite some time now. And when we were having this conversation, the two ideas kind of came together and merged. And so, of course, with time, then the idea evolved into what you see in the paper. At least in my experience, the original idea you start with, for example, the idea we published, evolves sometimes a lot, sometimes a little, even before you submit the paper. So there's an evolution that happens from ideation to submission, but then the idea also evolves as you go through the review process. And for us, at least at AMJ, several other journals, we find that the review process overall, for the most part, tends to be constructive. So if we look at the paper when it was submitted, and if we look at the paper that was accepted, it improved a lot. That in ways that we hadn't even considered before it went through the process. It took us about 5 years to 4 years to acceptance. So remember, Anand talked about ideation to first R&R. Right, Anand, if I'm not mistaken, that's what I wrote in my notes when you said 1 year and 2 months. Because as soon as you said 1 year and 2 months, I was like, I need to learn from Anand how to do this quicker because it's giving me a lot of time. But then thankfully you said first R&R. So for us, from ideation to final submission was 4 years. And so in my view, 2 to 5 years from ideation to submission is not uncommon for good quality papers to happen. I also, if you're interested, and this is my last comment, and then I'll give it back to Aarti. I also put together like a short video that explains kind of this process of, where do ideas come from in management research. So if you want to watch, I'm going to share the link with everyone, and then you can watch it.
Great, thank you so much, Vishal. That was very helpful, and to Anand and Tanvi, clearly your motivations are diverse. They come from a need to understand a very different way of understanding a specific phenomenon, such as what kind of empirical technique would be most relevant to study a specific topic. Some early imprinting impressions and experiences, either from one's own family business or childhood, or an article that inspires us in some way to dig deeper into a specific phenomenon. And Vishal, thank you for sharing about the process, because that segues into my second question, and also what I see here, a question from Trisha, if I'm not mistaken, which is about what is the probability of an idea transforming into an article, and what goes into it. So my second question to you is about trade-offs. And oftentimes, as young junior researchers, as PhD students, many of us earlier wanted to have the best, perfect methodology, the perfect paper, and then, of course, you send it to a reviewer. It comes back with all sorts of comments, trying to really reimagine what the paper is all about. It would be interesting for us to know what trade-offs you made in moving the paper from ideation to finally publication. Your interaction with the co-authors, maybe your co-authors wanted X and you wanted Y, or the reviewers wanted X and you wanted Y. If you had more time and resources, perhaps you would have used another methodology. What kind of challenges did you face, or dilemmas did you face, and the decisions that you ultimately live with in saying, all right, we stop here and go further? If you could share some light on that process, or the dilemmas of making those trade-offs, because I think oftentimes we get stuck and we don't know how to move forward in trying to get things published and not be stuck on finding the perfect solution. So maybe we start with Anand again on the topic, because clearly 1 year and 2 months is a record. Yeah, it's not something that's the average for most people to just get their idea right, and to formulate a hypothesis. So, what were the trade-offs for you in those 16 months or 14 months?
I just wanted to point out that my co-author was somebody who was not in the area of strategy, right? So the idea of trade-offs actually starts from there. And I remember that she wanted to write a paper that was more anchored in theory rather than in empirics. So right from the structure, I think we had to think about a bunch of trade-offs. She was more interested in the phenomenon, the theoretical phenomenon, or the idea around the markets for technology itself. Whereas I thought, right from the beginning, I thought we wanted to make it a more sort of a method piece rather than anything else, given the new methodology that we were using in the paper. So it emerged eventually between, the published piece eventually emerged as something that was a combination of both, right? So we do lay out the methodology, and then there is some, the theory comes in as a part of empirical illustration. And then it's also has a very deductive flavor to it rather than a traditional paper. To a large extent, some of these trade-offs or the answers to some of this diverse opinion between the co-authors, I must say, I was also shaped by the editor and the reviewers as well. So I think it's important to acknowledge the part that the reviewers and the editors play in sort of shaping some of these very nascent papers, which was certainly the case when we sent it for the first when we wrote up our first drafts. And I think the reviewers and the editors played a key role in terms of us resolving these trade-offs, right? So it's sort of this hybrid model essentially came from I think the suggestion that I think Will Mitchell was the editor on the paper. The suggestion essentially came from him about how to structure this paper. And that essentially enabled us to deal with this trade-off that we were grappling with, which also reflected in the writing, right? The first draft was sort of all over the place. And it was neither a method piece nor theory. So so that's one trade-off that I vividly remember, and so I would leave it there, and maybe I'll come back to it after I hear what my co-panelists have to say on that.
Okay, very good. Thanks, thanks, Anand. Tanvi.
So in my case, the trade-off was time, is how I would put it. And given that it was an inductive approach to the paper, I before it got to this version and before it got to this journal, it did receive a lot of rejections, and it shaped up very differently from where it originally started. But clearly, I had to cut down on the data that I had, because then I was spending a lot of my space in the paper, if I may say, explaining the approach or the methodology, because it was fairly new with IB. So that was the biggest trade-off. And then the other thing, when I say time as a trade-off, I had graduated, I had to go for tenure, and that was kind of my big thing. It's like, I need to get a good hit, but thankfully my co-author and my mentor kept me grounded in that game, constantly reminding me that, it takes time, and it's not going to be like, let's get it all done in a day type of a thing. And I would be amiss if I did not acknowledge the special issue editors, some of who are here today, and even the reviewers, to shape it up in a very different format. So a lot of the analysis, some of it was there in my dissertation, not included in the paper. We took it out, went back again, and so that was a iteration that took time from the initial submission to the final version of the paper. I will pass it on to Vishal in the interest of time here.
Thank you, Tanvi. So for me, the trade-offs were at two different levels. One line of trade-offs was that this paper has 2 management professors and 3 finance people, 2 finance professors and 1 finance PhD student. And those of you who read finance journals, you will see that they have a very different style of writing than management. Neither is good or bad, it's just different traditions of writing. And so for us, the trade-off, especially in the beginning, when we were doing our first submission to AMJ, was, what's the proper style of writing this paper? And, when all the three of us that are kind of the first, second, and third authors on the paper are about the same stage in the profession, which means, there's no one can pull rank, right? No one can say, well, do this. And so that became, an issue in terms of how to frame the paper, what was the right framing. And so there was that trade-off that we struggled with. The other trade-off that we struggled with was sort of personal, which is that, as I said before, the second co-author on the paper is the second author on the paper is my wife, and we've had several papers together, and I mean, she's a phenomenal scholar in her own right, so I learn a lot from her. But when you're working with a family member on the paper, and I work with both my sister and my wife on papers, the challenge is, how do you keep the personal and the professional separate, right? So, I mean, I don't think I'm the only couple or only family in the world where we have small mundane conflicts on a regular. Everybody has that, but how do you prevent that from kind of affecting the work? Because when you have a conflict, that's the paper you don't feel like working on. You're like, I'll do everything else but this paper, and that's not because you don't like the paper, but you just don't want to engage in conversation, or you don't want to have that debate about, should we do this method, should we not do this method, why are you not doing it this way or that way. You want to avoid another debate, and so that I think we've learned a lot kind of working with each other. So that was a trade-off, like when to make progress on the paper and when to let it kind of be. And we got a couple of extensions from the editors on the way, because we were not making enough, because it took us time to make that progress on the paper.
Thank you for sharing that to all the panelists. I've requested Naga privately for 5 minutes extra, because when we do speed dating with now how many 73 people, 1.5 hours is not enough, and I'm sure we have a lot more to share with each other, and we want to make the most of this opportunity that we have, all of us here together, talking about trade-offs, whether it's with methodology or the approach that the authors would take. And the time, and I think it's absolutely essential for young researchers, doctoral students, to get some training and understanding what does the research stamina really mean? How do you sustain that intellectual curiosity for 5 years, sometimes 7 years, on that one topic? And that segues to one of the questions from a panelist, from a participant here, which is to say another kind of trade-off in terms of relevance now and relevance later when it gets published, right? So how do you manage the generic question to all the panelists? We generally see that by the time an idea converts into a paper, it's already 2 years or 3 years, sometimes 7 years. Isn't that delaying the usefulness or the relevance of that idea to reach a certain audience? And whatever that audience might be, is it practitioners, is it another set of researchers, or a specific community that for whom you're trying to solve this problem or answer a specific question? We would take that as the final question from the audience, and I say that because we are going to have a lot of time with each other in the breakout rooms. So hold on to your questions. Don't let them go, and don't feel disheartened that it was not asked over here. We have another hour together, and this is also not the last conversation. Think of it as the beginning of a conversation. All right. So let's think of it as conversation starters, and we take this question, and then I will give you some instructions for the breakout room so that you can deep dive into many more questions that come up for you listening to the panelists here. So again, we go with Anand, Tanvi, and Gupta and Vishal in that order.
Yeah, I may not answer this with this paper, but in general, I think it's quite an issue, right? I mean, especially given the review cycles are long, and sometimes some of us are occupied, and we take longer to turn the review back in. This is a very good question, I think, but I suspect I don't have a clear enough answer. Simply because I've even recently had a situation in which one of the reviewers said, "Can you extend the data set?" Right, simply because your data is now old. Who knows whether the same set of phenomena exists right now? So I think maintaining relevance. So one way that I've always tried to do is every time I send back the review, I try to find more sort of anecdotal evidence which says that, oh, you know what, this phenomenon is still sort of relevant, and we still need to worry about it, even though the world might have moved on ever since we wrote this paper or the first draft of the paper. That's the only thing that I can say at this point in time. And of course, it's important enough to sort of keep so for people who are writing empirical papers, to keep the data relevant as well. So these are the only two quick tips that I might have, simply because this is an ongoing problem that I suspect I don't have more wisdom to add at this point in time.
Thank you, Anand. Tanvi.
So a couple of things is what I would add on to. So, relevant to this paper specifically, methods, right? I mean, 10 years ago, when you talked about qualitative semantic network analysis, it was somewhere too early to its time, right? I talk about it in the context of Google Glass. I mean, great product, came in too early. But in the recent conversations I've had, especially post-COVID, it's like, oh, this is a cool way. You didn't have to do field data, and this was a fantastic way to have your updated data at your fingertips, data mining, blah, blah, blah. So that was sort of one of the learnings that, I hung in there with things, and it seems much more relevant now. But it also gives me the ability to keep updating the data because it's not going to my primary sources. But on a similar thing, when I do a lot of, interview-based case studies. And oftentimes when it's sort of, it does take longer, but then it also gives me the ability to go back to my sources. So it has happened to me that, in a recent work that I was doing on women entrepreneurs, migrant women entrepreneurs, the data has been there for a couple of years because I've been building on it, but I have had the chance to go to those people and say, you know what, can we do a follow-up interview? And that does go into my managerial implications, etc., into the paper itself. So that's my second way of doing it. And thirdly, because I use a context-based approach, things might change, but the context doesn't, right? I mean, you're talking about emerging markets. The context is still there. The context is evolving as we speak. And that's something that I often, a lot of it is a process-based. And so I feel that that's embedded in the conversation itself. So it's not just that the data is what's spinning it, but it's the context that's embedded into the conversation. So those are my three little conversations there. Vishal, back to you.
So, as I said before, I think it takes about 2 to 5 years at least to publish a paper at a good journal in management. When I was in the PhD program, one of my professors said it took him 7 years to publish a paper, and I thought, oh my God, recently it took me 13 years to publish a paper that was started, 13, 14 years ago. So, that's kind of my contribution now to my PhD students. I tell them I heard 7, I did it in 13 or 14. So, who knows how long it will take in the future. But I don't think that I don't think that the ideas become old. It's like, especially think of things that are published in top journals. I think that the emphasis is on rigor. That means show us convincingly that the results you're talking about, the findings you're talking about, are what they are. That the arguments you're making conceptually are, as flawless as they can be. We know, for good or for bad, and we can have this conversation another place, that the audience for our papers is not practitioners, it is academics, at least in the academic journals. I'm not talking Harvard Business Review or California Management Review or whatever. AMJ, JWB, SMJ, JOM, the audience is other academics. And it's not like if you published, let's say gender research 5 years ago, that 5 years later gender research is dated. It's not. And so I think the emphasis is on rigor, and that's why it takes so long to publish. And in my view, that's a common mistake that PhD students make, both in India and in the US, at least what I see. But especially I see this in India, where I think there's not an understanding of how long among PhD students of how long it takes to publish good quality papers. I recently had someone say, "Oh, we've been working on this paper for 5 years. Will it ever get published?" There was a sense of frustration in my co-author's voice, and I just sat back and just watched TV because I was like, 5 years is no big deal. I just published something that took 13 years. So, I mean, 5 years is nothing. So that's just how the profession works. And we can say that's not right. We can say it should be published quicker. But imagine when you get a paper as an editor or a reviewer, like, are you able to turn it around any faster than they are when you submit as an author? And most of us would say it doesn't happen. So, that's the way it works.
Thank you for that again. I mean, these are very interesting debates to be had on rigor, relevance, and reach, because our audiences are different, and they also evolve depending on where you are, how you study what you study, and who you intend it for. So why don't we segue? Again, keep in mind, this is the beginning of the conversation. Don't fret if you haven't asked your question. You will have plenty of time to do that. Thanks a lot to the panelists for starting this discussion. It's a great it's a great conversation starter for me tonight. It's 10 p.m. here, and I look forward to hearing sort of eavesdropping into all the breakout rooms, but also hearing back at this sharing session when we come back in about 30 minutes or so.